Hey, folks, this is the Trust in the Process podcast with myself, Travis Fritz, brewer and owner at Old Nation Brewing Company in Michigan. This is a podcast designed specifically for brewers and people interested in the beer industry, but also folks that are just fans of craft beer and would like to meet some of the personalities involved in it. And today, I am delighted that we have one such personality in Joe Tucker, who was instrumental and kind of really the driving force behind Rate Beer, which is, if you don't know, one of the websites and apps which people use to do exactly what the name says, which is rate beer. Generally, beers are divided into categories and subcategories, and styles which fit into those categories or subcategories are ranked by anyone who would like to do so and graded, most commonly on a 0 to 100 scale, but oftentimes with a sort of 5 bottle caps or 4 stars or however the rating system works. But in my opinion, it has fundamentally changed craft beer, how brewers look at craft beer, how consumers look at craft beer, frankly, the way that writers write about craft beer. All of this has changed, and I could not be more happy to bring you on, Joe. We've tried this before. We're now videoless podcast, and I'm happy to get back into it with you and to introduce you to the folks who might be listening.
Excellent. Thanks. Yeah, so glad to be here, Travis, and thanks for that wonderful intro.
Of course, I would say you've earned it. Now we've again, everybody should understand that we went into this and did about 10 minutes of podcast before our internet out here in Williamston stopped cooperating. But to go over a little bit of it again, you, and I think we'll reorganize a little bit maybe. You came into craft beer, and I don't want you to date yourself unnecessarily, Joe, but to give a little bit of perspective, you came into craft beer, what era would you say? I mean, in terms of the date?
Oh, yeah. Well,
your own
it's an interesting perspective in that, like, I guess the era that I mean, it was the 90s when I was kind of really getting into local craft beers in California and Oregon, where I kind of went to post-college. But I mean, that era was one where the first waves of craft brewers were kind of setting up a lot, where, you know, the brew pub model took off. And so Rate Beer was born at a time when a lot of that was collapsing. It was really the doldrums after that wave had collapsed. You still had survivors like Stone, Sierra. Sierra came on a little earlier, but yeah, it was kind of in the doldrums of that wave of craft brewing. You know, people. I guess we used to refer to that derogatorily as brew by numbers.
Yes.
Where you could download recipes from the internet, open your brew pub, and just brew some kind of darkish beer or some kind of reddish beer.
Yeah.
You know, a couple
probably
of
wheat
beers.
beer, maybe with fruit if you were going crazy.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was it. Simple times. And I guess, you know, that was the reason for the collapse, is if it got that easy, then it wasn't going to work.
Well, I spoke to Mitch Steele at length for the podcast, as a brewer who I hold in high regard.
He's wonderful.
Wonderful as a person and as a brewer. And I think one of the interesting things we touched on, and I'm interested to see what your perspective is on this, was I think we were talking about the time period around, 1999, 2000. And even earlier, I would say, but in that later part of the 90s, where it seemed like, again, as a brewer or a brewery owner, nascent or otherwise, it was enough to just have a brewery that made good beer, right? There wasn't any other, as you said, there were a few different styles. I mean, remembering for folks that don't, that this is before West Coast IPA was the phenomenon that it is now, right?
Yeah.
When a West Coast IPA, the first time I had one, I was like, who would drink this? Absolute homunculus. I mean, it's a crazy idea, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was normal. I grew up in California and Washington,
Sure.
or Oregon. So it was like, it was normal to us, like Sierra and, Anchor, these types of bitter beers were just around.
Right. And I think
Dry.
yeah, I think that it from my perspective as a brewer in the very early 2000s and as a home brewer in the late 90s, was that of course, there had been, even here in Michigan and I think in the Midwest, which is often slow to catch on to trends that start on the East or West Coast, there had already been sort of that, what for us was the first wave locally, but really the second wave of craft brewers in the 90s, who had kind of crested and crashed. I mean, there were a ton of breweries that you'd find in gas stations here in Michigan that just shut down. And it seemed like it happened within the space of about a year. And it seemed like that was in between late 1998 and 2000.
Yeah.
And then a sort of resurrection of the scene slowly over the course of 5 or 6 years, which grew into, of course, what we have now, that's been so heavily influenced by beer rating sites, I think, and the way that the customer's priority has changed. Maybe it hasn't changed, but there is an extant and palpable groupthink about beer that changes from year to year or era to era. But it's much more consistent than when I'm putting words in your mouth here, but when I certainly, and I think a lot of us who have been doing this for a long time, would read a Michael Jackson book, and that would kind of be our perspective. He was a smart guy who took this really seriously. And if he liked Pilsner Urquell, then I would too, What do you think about all that, kind of the change in brewers and how sites like Rate Beer have affected it? And if you'd like to kind of explain maybe first what you saw Rate Beer as initially and what it grew into.
Yeah, that's oh my gosh, it's such a neat topic, and that it's it really was what interested me. I mean, my background is in psychology, and I learned a lot about beer and books before I kind of tasted them, thanks to Michael Jackson.
Right.
And so when we made Rate Beer, and I was also a home brewer, so like when we made Rate Beer, I changed the rating system to fit more closely to the homebrew model, and then there were a bunch of homebrewers on the site, and I just I guess I had a lot of respect for this international group of people. Was Guinness. But we sort of got informed from all these different angles. There were obviously like industry on the site. Quite a few brewers, and we sort of kind of put together this feedback system. I mean, that was what I was doing professionally before Rate Beer, was putting sites, big internet websites, in touch with their users through user testing and interviews and things, and then working with engineers to improve those sites. And so I guess I sort of formed Rate Beer into that model. I knew that we're going to be like providing feedback to brewers, and things were going to kind of evolve from that. The craft beer community was tiny, and it was really human. And like I said, we had industry on the site. We're giving feedback all the time. How do we make this better?
One of the things I found really interesting when reading some interviews that you had done, and some really well-written ones, by the way, was the idea that care for an honest outcome, an outcome that wasn't, that is to say, ratings being the outcome,
Yeah.
an outcome that wasn't that was as minimally influenced by, for example, purposeful people coming in and saying, I don't like the guy that owns that brewery, so I'm going to rate all his beers low. And I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I guess my point is, I don't mean to. My point is, this was a methodical process that you were paying attention to and trying to optimize as often and efficiently as possible in order to relate an honest outcome in review. By the way, as simple as, how is this beer rated generally, and how is this beer rated amongst its style partners? So
Yeah.
maybe a simpler one, but that's fascinating to me. And I wonder, it seems like it must have been kind of overwhelming to keep it as fair as you kept it. What did that feel like? What was that like for you?
Oh, I mean, that was it. Gosh, I don't know if it was this version or last version of the show when we talked a little bit about just getting in touch with your audience. Like,
Sure.
And I mean, this was my thing in usability, but like with brewers and sort of getting out there and talking to people. My wife had encouraged me to get out from behind my computer and actually talk to people, talk to brewers, because that's, it's what I do. So I, was talking with users of the site all the time. And it was just really good to talk to people from the industry, in breweries. So go on brewery tours and talk to people about the site. Rate beer wasn't universally known back then. And it was, I had the opportunity to talk to people about rate beer who didn't know about it.
Right.
But yeah, I was kind of distilling all that feedback. And, like people know, we live in a smart, generous, real respectful group of we have a really great group of people out there in the beer industry. So yeah, I kind of distilled that feedback and was open to all the criticism. There's a lot of criticism of it in the early days, and I just sort of kept honing. Yeah, some of it was really painful. I remember the first feedback that I got, and this is, you recognize it. I was trying to make, a good, honest website and provide good, honest feedback. And I think something that really stung was we'd started giving out these Rate Beer Awards in 2002. I'd looked at it and said, wow, we can probably develop meaningful awards from all this feedback. So after a while, it had become apparent that everybody's attention was on the small Trappist brewery in Belgium called West Vleteren. And so, I think it was 2005, maybe, that all of a sudden we thought we were really tiny, that Rate Beer, no one paid attention to it, that it was the same, a few thousand people that were coming to the site, and then that's where we existed. I'd never really seen Rate Beer much in print, and then all of a sudden, we were on Belgian TV. And someone had caught a line of cars into West Vleteren because at this latest release it was a big deal because of Rate Beer, and there was a dramatic moment in the news clip where a fist fight erupted, and so this got back to me. That it was our fault that
that there was a fist fight at a Belgian monastery.
Well, yeah, and this fever and this kind of craze was our fault, and that we should have provided a heads up or whatever. That was from Tim Webb, who's written books on Belgian beer, English expert. Yeah, he probably doesn't need much intro for your guests. But yeah, that really stung. That, I mean, his assumption was that we weren't really doing anything to recognize our potential harm. So yeah, I was trying to, after that, I was trying to be a bit more careful, both about our numbers, to be sure that we were very careful with the accolades we were delivering, and then also with giving people heads up who might need it. I know that kind of came back to us too, even years later, when small breweries would win and then be overwhelmed suddenly.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe chalk that up into the good problem to have category, but certainly, echoes of, let's say, festival organizers in the 60s and 70s who, with all good intentions, would put on these huge, let's say, Woodstock. And, in retrospect, there seemed to be a lot of problems that they should have seen, but no one had done that before. I mean, the impetus to do it didn't even exist. So
yeah,
I wonder if that might resonate to you. And another issue that I think this dovetails into, or maybe topic, is so as a brewer who was brewing, is the topic would be ego here, I suppose, from beer writers maybe and brewers as well, who were used to having some hegemony on what the opinions of the consumer should be, if that makes sense. So to put it in context, I know that, we talked a little bit about, I had experience in Germany. I went to school there and became a brewmaster there as a very young man, and then came back to the States and was able to work under Pierre Celis and Jean-Luc Seiss and just all these great brewers. Yeah, it was lucky, right place, right time, and right ability to speak a foreign language that I never needed to learn, I guess. But in any event, the people who had trained me were essentially from the perspective of, tradespeople, and therefore, all felt as though they were the final word on what good beer was, right?
Right.
And the overwhelming sense that I got from all the masters under whom I worked and folks who trained me, and therefore myself, was this shouldn't be taken away from brewers, right? If this gets taken away from brewers, then what we're going to have is just a cavalcade of folks who have no training, no experience, no ability, flooding into the market, and whatever catches folks' attention will be the new greatest beer, as opposed to whatever is fundamentally the greatest beer. From the perspective of now, that sounds really primitive and short-sighted. But I wonder, because it was so intense, that kind of pushback against these sites for me and the brewers I was around at that time, I wonder if that trickled up to you, or if it just came to you as kind of a tinny distaste from brewers about this issue of beer rating sites generally, or how did you experience that?
Wow. Yeah, that was, my interest in usability, website usability, came when I was at CNET, which is used to be a big deal in San Francisco. I kind of left the software company to go work left the kind of game company in Oregon to go work in the internet in San Francisco at CNET, which was like one of the main sites on the internet back then. And so we built a lot of websites there. And what we realized pretty quickly was that nobody could use them, or they weren't using them in the way that we intended. And the designers would make pretty stuff, and the engineers would kind of build the website as they saw fit. And engineers aren't really good at understanding, what we were running into was that the creator, the person who was making things, was not really real great at intuiting what their customers wanted. So,
Right.
so I really had that kind of, I felt that from the other side as a creator,
Got it.
that, that what I wasn't doing wasn't working. But the answer was talking to that consumer. And so, yeah, that's the way we built Rate Beer, was by talking to people who were using Rate Beer. And I felt, there was this almost religious idea that brewing could be better by putting brewers in touch with their consumers, warts and all. Also, maybe it was this almost political thing for me as well, which is kind of revolutioning, democratizing Rate Beer, democratizing ratings. I mean, at the time, there were very few other rating sites. Rate Beer was one of the first, doing it right. That, and I'm, it sounds real arrogant, but I only started. I put a lot of effort into just the rating system. Talked to mathematicians, statisticians who are way smarter than me to help me code it. And it was Scientific American, kind of magazine I loved reading as a kid, that published an article on Rate Beer's rating system, comparing us favorably to eBay and Amazon. So it was really cool. It was neat validation for all the work we put into it. But yeah, we were trying really hard on just creating a good rating system.
And fair, as I know we've talked about.
Yeah.
Which, it took me, to give a personal anecdote again, I guess, it took me a long time to understand. Well, frankly, if I'm being honest, I, probably was exposed to Rate Beer again, maybe 2006 or so. Mm-hmm. And, the way I was exposed to it was I was working at a pub in Detroit, making, whatever beer I was interested in making that folks would drink. Right. I mean, there was that interaction. And I think at a pub basis, it's sort of hyper localized. You're worried about who's coming in and drinking your beer and what it is. Which is interesting, I think, particularly for a professional brewer that was trained in one style grouping to spread themselves out. And that used to be able to happen over the course, frankly, of a career. But in any event, I'm there in the pub, and it was my want to stay after quite often and pour beer for people, or maybe have one with some folks. And little by little, I saw people coming in with notebooks. And again, this is before smartphones, so they would be coming in with notebooks, and they would be furiously kind of writing. And you'd see that occasionally before this time, but not anywhere near as frequently as I began to see it. And so interacting with those folks and saying, listen, I notice a lot more of you are doing this. Why are you doing this? And that was how I got introduced to Rate Beer. They were taking notes to go upload them onto Rate Beer as ratings. And, stupidly as a brewer, I pushed back on that for 10 more years. Right. I'm not going to pay attention to Untapped or Rate Beer or any of that stuff. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to do it well. People will accept it, all that kind of stuff. Real dumb, real starving artist. Cost myself and a lot of other folks a lot of money. But then we released in 2016, after, I'd opened up Old Nation as a, pretty big, 10,000 barrel brewery, making, traditional styles. I thought it was time for those to come back. I'd seen it happen on the West Coast and the East Coast. And, what followed was a resounding thud. The beer was good and nobody cared. Right.
Yeah.
So how do I fix this? Right. So I went onto these Facebook groups, these beer enthusiast groups. I lurked there for months trying to figure out what it was that they were talking about that I could do as well as or better than anyone else, and stumbled upon New England IPA. And I will tell you this, my opinion on beer rating sites practically shifted almost overnight, because what we got was, instead of people saying, why are these people so boring, saying, oh my God, this is the most incredible thing I've had. You have to go buy it. And 10X business within 5 months. But it became, for a while for me, and I think for a lot of other brewers, and this is really my point, and a lot of other brewers who had luck on these sites, to begin to think about how to manipulate them to our own benefit, which I think is bad for craft beer. And that is to say, everyone at that time, 2016, was making New England IPA, and everyone was changing one or another hop, changing the label, and then making, $100,000 on a release. And It was easy. It felt like you were getting away with something, right?
Yeah.
So we stopped doing it because I didn't feel like it was right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wonder how that kind of, okay, so this is an isolated anecdotal story that I just told you, I guess. But how does that resonate to you? Do you see that? And do you think that it matters? I guess is my question to you.
Oh gosh. I mean, man, I mean the tough thing about producing anything is that you're kind of doing it in an environment with customers, right? You got to make money at this stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, although we we love our crafts. I mean, we love what we make as creators. There has to be somebody who who pays us for it, typically, so yeah, I don't know how many brewers that I talked to that went through a similar path where they're like, no, we just aren't gonna make IPA. We're just not gonna do it. And if I would talk, I talked to some of those brewers before they started and said, you might do one IPA,
right,
just to help pay the bills. You got bills right now. You might, just put one, start with one. And a lot of those have turned into IPA brewers. But gosh, there was a story that I'd read about David Byrne from the Talking Heads, and how the biggest kind of change, he started it. He was like, one of these art school band type guys. And when he learned after a taste of success that he should think about himself as an entertainer, it was both a blow to his ego, but at the same time, turned him into a professional artist.
And with a guy like David Byrne, you can see that he took that upon himself. He took it upon himself as a challenge to do that as well as possible. I don't know if you saw his HBO special that he did not too long ago, a year ago or so. But an absolute titan of what it is that he does. I mean, I don't know how you could do that better, but he's doing his own thing, right?
Yeah.
There's a sense that and I think we're talking about brewers too, maybe, he may be doing his own thing that no one else could quite do, but it's clear watching and listening to him that anyway, nobody could do it better, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a lot of those brewers that I talked to about making an IPA, they'd always say, but everybody's already making IPA. Why would they want IPA from me? And it's like, well, everybody's take is different. There's room for limitless IPAs.
Right.
And, I guess consumers think about it as, why would you open a pizzeria without a pepperoni pizza? And so it sort of works the same way at the till. I mean, it's unfortunately, there are people who get away with it, but yeah, the general rule is, hey, we're here with consumers, and you got to give them what they want. So yeah, I think, generally I'm pretty conflicted about this. It sort of I feel the need for freedom from that, and the ability to kind of shape what's going on from the other direction, instead of kind of, you know, doing what you can to game it from just like giving people what they want, to being able to shape it with new, by opening their eyes to new flavors and new ideas.
Right.
I like that creative end a little more, but it's important to pay the bills.
It is, but I mean, it also is the difference I think we're talking about here, to bring it back to music even, and keep it in the same lane, is the difference between, let's say, the Talking Heads and Britney Spears, right?
Right.
That's there. I mean, you can put some different labels on the Talking Heads, but Talking Heads anymore are a pop band, right?
Yeah.
And Britney Spears is also a pop artist, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, they're serving a lot of the same people quite often, but one is clearly concerned about how they do what they do and to what end, and the other maybe not so much, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's always been incumbent upon brewers to do that, whether Rate Beer exists or not, right?
Yeah.
I think that what Rate Beer and sites like it, apps like it, might have done is to speed up that the normal evolution that was there, and make that responsibility from a brewer's perspective of progressing and identifying yourself, and being as good as you can be, and spreading out and finding niches that you can fill much more rapid, right?
Yeah.
And to tradespeople, I think, like me, who, you know, came into the industry as a German trained brewmaster with no real perspective on American craft beer at all, it's frustrating, right? To have to keep up with everything, and you feel like quite often, as a brewer, I don't mean to turn this into a therapy session, but as a brewer, you don't have as much time as you'd like to examine a certain style, for example, or a certain method of brewing, or a certain traditional technique, or a certain something new. You kind of just have to ditch it and move on to the next thing, which is frustrating. But I don't think the fundamental fault there is, you know, Rate Beer or Untapped or Beer Advocate or whatever. I think what those sites did, again, was just speed up that process of evolution of the individual brewer. And it's my sense that that's generally the pushback from brewers to these sites, is that at the core of it, it's a frustration that they just can't take their time with stuff anymore.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm all in on the therapy session there. It really has sped up the evolution of sort of catering to, like, as craft beer grew and people were fighting for like to expand the number of, because the whole idea way back when was, we'll just make good craft beer, and because it's much better than other options, we don't, you know, rising tide floats all boats. We'll just increase the tide, and more people will jump on, and we'll all be good. But after a while, that stopped working, and people wanted to appeal to a greater number of people, and so beers got sweeter. Candy, fruit started coming in, and at what point do you say, especially as someone who appreciates, you know, great Belgian, great German beer, heck, great early American craft beer, when do those worlds start to diverge?
Right.
When are we in a whole new world? And I, you know, gosh, I'm old. I'm over 50, and so there's this whole. I feel like I'm in a different world altogether, and just because I'm old, but but yeah, there's this. When I go out to drink beer, I realize, hey, there's this brewery over here, and they make things that just don't feed my soul.
Yes.
And then there's this place over here that, I'll sit with a beer and feel it up to like over 50 degrees, and it's still making those great aromas that take me back. I mean, it's awesome that kind of brewing's still out there.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, the stuff when I go into a grocery store and look at the myriad of choices there, gosh, even at a place like Whole Foods, which used to have kind of upper tier commercial stuff, I mean, it's mostly just, boy, it's like sugary,
Yeah.
sweet things that are pasteurized so they don't explode on the shelf, and it's like, wow.
Well, right,
Different
and
world.
I think in order to bring as many folks as possible into, and I think it's funny that you bring up feeling old, because I think that's endemic in brewing right now. I mean, I think a lot of the people in positions of command within breweries and in the industry generally have, including myself, have aged out of not relevance, but have aged out of a consistent awareness of how the folks they're selling beer to actually think and what it is that they want. So, for example, you kind of intimated this. I'll expand on it. If you disagree with me, please say so. But it seems like in the last, let's say, 10 years, again, these dates are all arbitrary because different parts of the country start at different times. But for the last 10 years or so, the driving force behind a lot of what salespeople call innovation in brewing has been to make an effort to make beer taste like something that is not beer, right?
Yeah.
Whether that be, as you say, sweet, a lot of fruit, whether it's, Vietnamese cacao nibs and, South Asian cinnamon, whatever it is. And I think, by the way, that kind of exploration is fantastic. But I also think that as a brewer, of course, I'm going to have my hill to die on. And that hill is, there has to be an idea of what beer has been, just to have perspective on how beer as a beverage serves humanity to the extent that it does, right?
Yeah.
That it's a blue collar beverage. And if you dress it up too much, I think you really do need to be careful. And by the way, I just sold, 10,000 case equivalents of a strawberry flavored version of my flagship beer, which is a New England IPA. So I'm talking out of my ass a little bit here, but, again, I think that it's more where the industry of craft beer is, that it's in this weird middle ground. It's not anywhere near as big as the larger breweries still. And there's this long tail of small breweries that aren't making much beer really at all. And we find ourselves kind of, as mid-tier breweries like Old Nation is, kind of crushed on both ends as to what to do. And I will say that looking at Rate Beer particularly, for me at least, is a good place to go get insight, because it seems to me like, and I know you don't have as much skin in the game as you used to. I'm not telling you this to pay a compliment necessarily, but I think it bears saying that Rate Beer is still, and I think it's a function of having been one of the first or the first, a place where you can go and get relatively considered feedback on your beer as a brewer. And I think that customers as well can look at a site like Rate Beer and to some extent Beer Advocate as places to go and get relatively well-considered perspective on beer. I would say that apps like Untapped, for example, I hate to put it this way, but I can't think of another way. Maybe you can think of a better way. Maybe democratize this whole thing a little bit too much, right? 2 stars, Matt, I don't like lager. Yeah, that's not as useful as a review you might get on some of the other sites. So I don't want to put you in a position where you are, denigrating any other app or rating system. But I do feel like this whole evolution that we were talking about sped up even more after the introduction of Untapped. As a pretty primary way people buy their beer, Untapped has become made it even weirder. And I wonder if that's something you've talked to anyone about or gotten any feedback on before.
Yeah, it's sort of, you know, Rate Beer had kind of developed an identity as the sort of geeky place to go. And we attracted that kind of group, for better, for worse. I realized that it was hindering us paying the bills. Like, that it, I'd spent all this time with feedback from this group, and we had formed this kind of geeky, insular culture, and it made it harder for people with more popular tastes to come and enjoy the site. It was just geeky. We had more like graphs, and people spoke more. We encouraged people to get educated, and had resources available for that, links, and yeah, it sort of turned some people off. So I kind of realized where we were, and that maybe somebody who could reach a wider audience would be a lot more successful. And eventually, yes, that came along.
That happened. Yeah.
But yeah, like you, yeah, I sort of saw the same thing. It was really neat that the Rate Beer crew was like, they were still providing great feedback. I think we were producing quality ratings, and the number one beers on the site weren't things that you could buy in a 7-Eleven. So yeah, I mean, which has happened.
It does. Well, I mean, but Rate Beer could live and die, in my opinion, on the fact that West Veteran was your first sort of foray into popularity. I mean, at least it was a brewery deserving of the trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was tough, though. It sounds like that was painful.
Well, yeah. I mean, from so many angles, it was. Yeah, it was this. Gosh, because I guess that got us media attention as well.
Right.
That was the first sort of. CNN Money did an article on Rate Beer, and so that was like, oh my God, people are listening to us. And after that, there was a lot more international media attention to Rate Beer, and it sort of solidified this idea of what we were, and also kind of isolated us in that, like, oh, the top 50 beers on your site, I can't get, any of them, or
Right.
I can get one of them, and I have to stand in line for a day to do that. I mean,
right.
So yeah, yeah, with that kind of geekiness and popularity, it was this weird thing that this confirmation that, yes, you guys are insular weirdos living in the world.
I should have organized this a little bit better, but I think because we had a little technical difficulty in the beginning, there's some stuff that I missed, and I want to go back to your experience with Rate Beer. You talk about you just said that there was some international influence, and I wonder if you have any perspective on how genuinely international that was, and maybe impressive numbers about how many breweries and beers had been rated. Were people interacting in different languages? I mean, how widespread did this become?
Yeah, when I came to Rate Beer, and I'm not sure if I'd gone over that this time or not, but it wasn't my site. And the group there at Rate Beer was, I guess, most prominent was the most common raters were a guy from Sweden, Pierre, and Josh from Canada. And so I guess Philly Beer was up there too. from Philadelphia, obviously.
Okay.
So it was kind of an international group to start with. So we, as we developed the site, we kept in mind that people were speaking different languages, that people, were drinking very different beers and beer types, that they had different ideas about beer styles. So yeah, that was something that started at Rate Beer from the very beginning, and I love that about Rate Beer. And it was something that I tried to appreciate always, and always accommodate the varied cultures around the world.
And in the way you were interacting with the site was, is it fair to say you were kind of its architect, its engineer? I mean, you wore many hats and had quite a job, is what it sounds like to me.
Oh gosh, yeah. So I started doing work for the site. I guess a year after it was produced, and then it was started, and then pretty much had changed all the code. And they gave me the site about a year and a half later, and that was So it was doing pretty much everything, all the design, and then ultimately incorporating it as a business and all of that. After it took off, after this hobby became a thing that needed support.
So
yeah.
You're involved. You kind of have your head in the machine a lot, it seems like, and more than just your head in the machine. The interaction with the consumer was so crucial to you, and the idea of fairness and all of these kind of things. I wonder, in all of that, how often it seems like it would be important to you after having spoken to you for about an hour. But important or not, how often did you have the opportunity, if ever, to kind of pull your head out of that machine and look at things like, geographic differences in taste, or tendencies of one group or another to appreciate maybe one style or another, or one brewery or another? Did you have an opportunity to do much of that, or was it one of these things where you just kind of building it, working on it, and then eventually, I suppose, selling the company, which I'd love to have you talk about as well, if you'd like.
Yeah. It's I was talking to people and building, and my wife really encouraged me to just get out and talk to people. And that, with that came travel, and that was something that really kind of opened my eyes to different tastes, different ideas about beer, and some were quite surprising. I remember going to an IPA tasting back east, and they were, I'd already gotten a kind of reception of these great new American IPAs. Gosh, I took some Great Divide, some Bigfoot from Sierra, and this was right after. I'd had a facto, if you know what that is, in Rate Beer lore. A facto is when you take a special release beer that's like tap only, and you put it in, you fill a bottle with it and cap it on premise. Looks super bad. Don't ever do that.
Please don't.
But way back in the day, this was the way that you got amazing beers out to the world from breweries of new breweries that were blowing people's minds in your local area. So, Three Floyds came out, and we got these samples that were factoed at the brewery and shipped out via air. And I took a couple of these to England, and I remember several people just going, "This is undrinkable. This is complete madness." And it's abusive.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
were, yeah, there were a lot of just great reactions that I was getting right there, and that was amazing. So yeah, uh, I tasted a bunch of IPAs. I think it was in Pennsylvania around the same time, and was like, wow, none of these are IPAs. Like,
Right.
what's considered bitter here is very, very different. Everything was kind of bittersweet. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, and so it was more sweet to my taste, and the mouthfeel because of that was extremely different. They were
Yes.
thick and heavy, and yeah. So it's that was an amazing period, and it was before there were no craft brewers, were very few craft brewers that were selling in between states. I mean, that's and not a lot of people traveling. I guess that was the cool thing about Rate Beer is it was a big hit among people who traveled for their work, and so they were able to go in between different places and compare beers that were otherwise kind of not being compared to beers in other places.
I remember, I don't know, maybe 2002, sitting down with a few bottles of Pliny and a few bottles of Two Hearted from Bell's, of course, here in Michigan. And, Two Hearted and Pliny still, monoliths almost within craft beer, but very, very different to your point. Interesting to me, and I probably, I know that I made this up. I'm sure that it doesn't really have as much of a touchstone as I feel like it does, but that Pliny is a beer I would drink if I was in California where it's hot, and as simple as Two Hearted being a beer that I would expect to drink up here in the north where it is often quite cold. It seemed. Because I was raised as a brewer in the perspective that, regionality and differences in water sources and climate were extraordinarily important to the development of individual styles. They're practically necessary. That had, and again, I'm putting that on this. It probably had nothing to do with it at that time. I mean, heating exists and all that now, but that these regional differences may have expressed something innately about the folks that were drinking these beers.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That a Pliny may not have done that well in Michigan, right? Without being Pliny, right? And having that kind of fanfare around it. But that Two Hearted did. And there are so many variables that go into that. I understand it's a minimalist perspective, but still, I think those kind of thoughts and those kind of thought exercises maybe don't happen quite as much anymore, right? It's the internet culture, and so everything is available all the time. And I wonder how important that was to beer, and if it's really been lost, and if so, does it matter? Those kind of things are what we think about a lot.
Yeah. Travis, that's a really interesting topic, and something that, on my radio show, I met this that was, so we're talking like late 20-teens in Santa Rosa. I met a chef who came out to Sonoma County from back east, and she was talking about how there's really there's different flavors that a different palate that she's cooking for, that wines, people drink their coffee bitter on the West Coast versus where she was from in the Northeast. And they drink their wines are tart or more tannic. And so, there's this more, it's just generalized, but there tends to be this more of an appreciation for bitter and less so with sweet out west versus where she's from. And so I think, there was this weird, there's actually an idea that physiologically people are who are more into exploration
Sure.
are also more appreciative of bitter, and that the kind of Western movement of folks in the U.S. was propelled by these explorers or explorer types who ended up being more appreciative of bitter. And there are records of this going back to the 1800s, the gold rush, when people in travel magazines reported on the bitter, very bitter flavor of San Francisco beer.
Huh.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry that it took us an hour to get to this, Joe, because this is where the podcast is, man. This is great.
Right on.
So, I think back on, my buddies who still work as brewers and professors and masters that I had in Germany, and going back there, let's say in 2012, and bringing some examples of American beer, and knowing that these guys were going to hate it, right?
Yeah.
My own examples, which at that time were firmly traditional. I think I was making an alt beer and a Pilsner on the market. And then a stout that we put chocolate in for a popular chocolate company out here and whatever. And then, whatever I could get my hands on. So, Two Hearted, Little Founders, some stuff from the West Coast. I think Firestone Walker. I think they were making Pivo pills at that time. Anyway, so I brought all this stuff over there and I sat down with, a bunch of us had gotten together at a buddy of mine's house in Berlin. And we were sitting around, just shooting the shit. Here's these beers, guys. I want you to try them. It was an obligation to them, clearly, to do so. But they did. And I remember the most impactful comment, a lot of grimaces and whatever, but I remember the most impactful comment was from a buddy of mine who said, he was talking about how he was struggling to talk about it. And he said, I struggle to find anything fundamentally wrong with the execution of these beers. But the question I have for you is, why does it have to be so goddamn loud? Right?
American.
Right. And I was like, well, why does it have to be so goddamn loud? It comes from the United States, man. That's why.
Yeah,
and this is all a bunch of you guys, and all this bullshit. But dovetailing, I think, into what you had just said about these regional differences and these, of course, what you're talking about is much more innate, but even these cultural differences between Europe and the United States, which everyone could probably intuit and imagine. I've noticed that one of the styles that, let's say, the nascent craft brewing community in Western Europe, and particularly Germany, have glommed onto is New England IPA, which is, makes, again, intuitive sense because it's a popular style. But the consumer in Germany, from buddies of mine who run craft breweries over there, is much more in tune with that style for reasons I can totally understand. And the perspective of those brewers is, look, man, it's drinkable. It's clear what the goal of the beer is, right? Which is to showcase hops. It's visually striking. And it's easily consumable in the kind of quantities Germans tend to drink beer, right? Exactly. So of course it would work. West Coast IPA is not that to them.
Right.
And so this is a statement, not a question, but I wonder how that resonates to you, and if I can get you talking about this stuff even a little bit more.
Oh yeah, I mean, the whole idea about like bitterness and exploration is a little kind of it's a little kind of wild speculation, but it's I think something the origin of the New England IPA as a solution to this that problem of bitterness not working for the New England market that drier bitterness of West Coast IPA. That's I think less speculative, and that's I was telling you about those beers in Pennsylvania that I was drinking that I didn't think were IPA, that were bittersweet, because the solution before New England IPA was, let's just balance bitterness with sweetness, and then people will like this stuff.
Right.
And that didn't really fly.
No.
So the solution, the New England IPA, was really a solution to that problem, where you can take something from hops, the aromatic component, minimize the bitterness. You don't have to have so much sugar then. And you could have something that was pleasing, and different hops came around too for this too,
Yes.
as well. So you have hops with mango and citrus expressions together versus pine and dankness, things that weren't as popular. But yeah, it's the New England IPA solved that problem, the West Coast IPA problem.
This has been my perspective too, and another offshoot, I think, or another part, let's say, of that evolution, which of course doesn't mean that New England IPA precludes West Coast IPA or anything. It's just that there's a pretty clear progression. We saw in I wonder about your perspective about this. We had seen New England IPA do well. It did well for us. Obviously, it still does. And we had seen almost immediately West Coast brewers come back with Brute IPA, right?
Yeah.
Which addressed a lot of the same issues that New England IPA did, but from what was, to me, a very clearly West Coast perspective, right? That now this is not bitter. It still has these floral disco hops that we're using in the New England IPAs, but is so dry, and the sweetness that is implied in the flavors of these newer hops, the flavors of tropical, sort of mango and what have you, are again implying sweetness to the drinker without any actual sweetness being there. And the potential for that style, I think, was unlimited when it first came out. I think, unfortunately, a lot of brewers didn't approach it from that perspective. The perspective of an evolution from New England IPA into yet another thing, but rather, this beer's supposed to be dry. How can we make it super dry? And that was pretty much it, right? I don't know if you were paying attention to all that when it happened, but I saw that again as a kind of an offshoot of that evolution that the West Coast turned into New England.
It's interesting that you tie those two together. I didn't see it at the time, but I can certainly see it now. That people were trying to reclaim that sort of that West Coast dryness, but and with the kind of new availability of such a wide array of aromatic hops. But yeah, it's I guess the problem that I saw these brewed IPAs have was just that it just seemed that no two brewers were making them similar from a profile perspective. So the consumer was really confused by what they were actually shooting for. I've heard, if it was like a champagne beer that people were shooting for, well, I've tasted very few that hit the mark, but yeah, it was an interesting phase, and I guess it was a solution that several brewers targeted in different ways and kind of hit different things.
We talked about Brewed a little bit, and if you feel like you finished your thought, then we can kind of move on, and we'll get to to wrapping it up. Okay. So, the one last thing I wanted to touch on here were these. Again, I think that West Coast IPA, New England IPA, Brute, let's say, for the sake of this conversation, were sort of intuitive progressions of one style as it matured and evolved, right? But then you have these styles that are clearly devised by marketing departments, right? So let's say, for me, an example of those styles was in the mid 2000s, the Cascadian Dark Ale, right? An unnecessary style almost completely, I think. Not that there weren't people that were doing it as well as it could be done, but the idea of the astringency of the dark malt and the bitterness of the hop, and I never had one that really rang true to me, which may be what we're talking about with the brewed IPAs as well. I know there are a lot of other styles like that, and I know you were paying attention to this on Rate Beer.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Did you develop a sense for when one of those things was happening? I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, and gosh, we had data to analyze, so we were, and people, there were always huge arguments about what was a style and what wasn't a style.
Right.
I mean, gosh, it would take us a year to ratify a new style because of all the argumentation, you know, some people, wanting a very clear indication that this was here to stay before the style was adopted into our canon. You know, I was kind of on the other end of things. I wanted to put styles in as soon as I could, to be on the front end of trends and whatnot. But you know, I didn't run the site as a you know, solo. Like I didn't just work as a dictator. I kind of listened to all my experts. So we were usually a lot slower to adopt new styles, but yeah, it's that sort of proliferation of what beer was going to become. And gosh, I think you know, some of the other beer rating sites have seltzers on them because they don't see any distinction between beer and these types of beverages, or it's narrowed. You know, that there's certainly a lot of brewers making them. That I guess all that started, I think, around that period you mentioned of let's make styles that no one needs and no one wants.
Right. Well, I think the idea from brewers was, I remember this happening, and I remember openly mocking it as a starving artist guy who was trying to sell people Pilsner that nobody wanted. You know, I'm going to do this because I don't think anyone else has. That was the driving force, right?
Everybody was explorers, right?
With varying degrees of skill to execute. And you know, and I remember standing around, you know, in my late 20s, so the tail end of the 2000s, and saying, I just don't think this is sustainable. You know, what is going to happen? And as it turns out, it's not that much different. It just happens a little bit faster, I think. So you push Rate Beer into this, you support, you do all you can for Rate Beer, until it, by hook or crook or luck or sweat of the brow, becomes something that truly does influence, particularly American, but it sounds like even international beer culture, how people see beer, how they share information about it, from whom they get their information. And at some point, you know, Rate Beer is sold. It became a big topic of conversation among brewers, certainly craft brewers. I think a lot of what people said about it and say when they talk about it now was ill-informed, I'll say. And what the mission of Rate Beer is now from what it used to be was a big topic of conversation, but I don't really see any practical difference at this remove. I wondered how that changing of the guard affected you, and what your perspective was on all of that.
Oh yeah, that's I mean, it was one of these things where Gosh, I had realized for many years that running the site solo was not something I can do, and hiring people, like I'd hire people as contractors to get little jobs done here and there.
Sure.
That I was kind of done with that as well. It was just too much work, and I was at work all the time. And adding more work like festivals or whatever was not really an option. It was just way too much. So I was looking for like investors who could also lend help, and it brought something to the table. And sort of, gosh, it took years of kind of jumping from one romance to the next. It was we were so close to signing with several different folks, and for whatever reason, usually this whole need to have someone be able to help um, like develop it and manage it kind of fell through. So that's why we chose this unlikely partner in Anheuser-Busch, and that they had the resources. They had a whole tech team to kind of start working immediately. And it's one of these things too that the I thought that the market was mature enough. I think for so many years we'd seen this division between big beer and craft beer, and how there were good guys and bad guys, and all of that, and that lasted, until I think maybe 2011, 2012, when I started first hearing people on the website talk about, how they're signing with an Anheuser-Busch distributor, how, no longer are these like, they were called shady practices of, they're illegal practices of, like,
They are.
that distributors would use at retailers, that they're now being used by, regional craft brewers as well.
100%.
So the world was different. There was a lot of gray lines, and I think after a few years of that, understanding that we're kind of all in the same gang, and it's not, I don't know. I was feeling a little, I'd heard a lot of like classist statements about people who drink, commoner's beer, and I knew several brewers who drank the stuff, and I would drink the stuff occasionally, and it was just this, I don't know, this, I'd come around to considering them as a partner because of this kind of new age in beer, and I thought we'd receive less of a kind of backlash because of starting this new relationship with ZX Ventures, which is an arm of AB InBev. But it was pretty strong, and it was pretty immediate from our inside group. I know we didn't tell the world for, I don't know, 6-8 months after, but of course I told all our insiders, and they had pretty strong reactions. There was also a lot of support, but it was a time of pretty huge adjustment. At the same time, I was getting that feedback. On the flip side, there were a lot of these problems that were immediately solved, like problems with search, problems with the site going down because we were basically running it on a hamster wheel because of our budget. And so, there was all this help, and I could go home and sleep at night, knowing that if the site went down, there was some kind of service that would wake up or was right there to keep the site going.
Well, that must have felt like a weight off your shoulders without question.
Huge, huge. Yeah, and after so long of like trying to find this support, because that was like another job unto itself, was looking for the help, which often meant travel and bringing my laptop just in case something happened, and yeah.
Oh, man, wow! So this entire journey for you is over the span of what is it fair to say, 15 years?
Oh gosh, no. I mean, I joined Rate Beer in 2001, so it's been over 20 years.
20 years.
And it was kind of one of these things where, gosh, yeah, as a person, internet interested in internet technologies and kind of doing software stuff, a lot of these startups they'd last 18 months,
Sure.
2 years, whatever. So I was hopping jobs like this for pretty much my career, and to kind of settle into this thing and be here for this long, it's like, wow, what a weird, wild journey.
So what are you interested in now? And do you know what is next for you now, or are you enjoying where you are, or both?
Gosh, I'm definitely enjoying where I am. It's just, we had to move out of the California market because we couldn't buy a home with with what we'd sold Rate Beer for. So we moved to Oregon, and I've just been loving it here. It's really amazing. I get out in nature a lot. It's still working from home, which is great. I've got a kid who's in high school, and to like kind of be there with him as he's growing up has been great. By working from home. But it's next steps, certainly something's coming soon. I don't know what. I'm kind of open to everything at this point. I certainly love beer. I kind of wonder if either it or I'm beyond some inflection point in which I can't carry on with it. But yeah, I've got a lot of I don't know. We'll see. I'm definitely one of the things I'm doing. I've had a bunch of hobbies during this period as well, just because who's ever operating on the site just wants to keep me away from the code.
Right.
But so yeah, I've been growing mushrooms at home, which has been awesome. Staring at my lab right now, and it's sort of like home brewing, but with different yeast.
So these are
different microorganisms.
You're one of us, right? One of the people that needs something to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And let's kind of just blow it out and see what we can do.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's fun, man. That's where you never know what you're capable of until you don't give yourself another option, right?
Exactly.
Joe, I know that there are at least dozens of things that we could continue on with, but I think this is probably a good place to end at least this episode. Yeah. And thank you so much for taking your time out. I mean, these folks like you are who I am trying to speak to. I don't know if this podcast will reach 10 or 100 or 1,000 people, but I'm very thankful for your time.
Oh my gosh. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And best of luck with the show. Thanks to John for the invite. We've been trying to hook up for years. One day I'll make it out to Michigan and we can have a beer together.
That sounds like an excellent plan. Joe, again, thank you so much for your insight. And I will look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon.
Sounds good.
All
have
right.
a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Cheers.